You're listening to Secure Ventures, the show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. I'm your host, Kyle McNulty. I'm also a full-time investor at InQtel, a strategic investor for the U.S. intelligence and defense communities. This show is a personal outside activity separate from and not affiliated with InQtel in any manner. All comments, opinions, and sponsorships are wholly independent. With me in this episode is Odysseas Lamcides. Odysseas is co-founder and CEO of Phylax, a Web3 security company building a security layer for blockchain-based protocols. Before Phylax, Odysseas worked at Nomad, a crypto exchange which suffered a $190 million breach in August 2022. In the episode, we talk about his unique background as a developer relations manager, the approach law enforcement takes to recover funds in the wake of a crypto breach, the different attack surfaces for the Web3 ecosystem, and more. If you're not a blockchain expert, do not worry. Me neither. There are still plenty of interesting high-level conversation points throughout. This episode is brought to you by Vulncheck. Vulncheck helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. Vulncheck gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about Vulncheck? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. Vulncheck has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. Vulncheck provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of Vulncheck data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With Vulncheck, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about Vulncheck and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Odysseas, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Kyle.
Yeah, so take me back towards the beginning of your career, because I think there's actually a particularly interesting and kind of unique story here, and that a lot of your kind of early technical and career experience stemmed from community management roles. And I think this is a fairly unique role in the tech ecosystem in terms of having to kind of build a brand of some sort of community, typically like an open source community, interact with a lot of the individuals who are actually using the tool, be both a champion of the product, but then also very much listen to the people who are providing feedback and make sure you're a positive liaison for that entire ecosystem. Tell me a little bit more about how you first ended up in that kind of community management role.
Yeah, so in my career, I always, they say the most important thing when you start a career is the first boss you have, right? So I always pursued careers with the product really made sense to me, right? So I was more focused on working on something I believe in than like what I actually do. So the first company I worked at was, I did product, right? So it was like engineering adjacent. And then I found another, company called NetData was infrastructure monitoring. So DevOps, low level, Linux stuff. I was really interested in what they're doing and helping developers become better effectively. And the only position they had was developer relations. So I was like, okay, it doesn't matter, let's do it. And I found doing product and then DevRel was a very interesting way to learn about a lot of things you have to do as a founder, right? Because as a founder, you have to do product, and as a founder, you have to understand how to talk with users, how to build open source communities. It really helps you empathize and learn all the strategies that you need to do anyway as a founder, and then you do it full time, right? So it's a very hard job actually being a dev. It's a extremely distraction driven, because all day you're on Twitter or in the community Telegram groups or, forums, and you have to become an expert in the product and basically serve as a part-time support staff, but also at the same time, go through user feedback, clean it up, translate that into the part of the product team. help them prioritize the features. You represent the company to the user and the user to the company, right? And after I did it for a year, I was certain I don't want ever to do it again. It's a very, like, DevRel is a very uh, actually, it's very hard to find good DevRels for that reason, because DevRels are engineers, right? It's just community management. You are with the user, helping them with developer tooling. Maybe you write some libraries. Like, basically, you have to do whatever it takes to help the user through their user journey. So it's very hard to actually, and as a founder, it was very hard to find good DevRels, which meant that very technically they're good engineers, right? Because they need to be able to understand the product, and they have to understand it to a level that they can be useful to users, but at the same time have a lot of empathy and presentation skills and media machine going on. Is actually good DevRels are actually a very expensive breed.
Yeah, I completely believe it. To your point, I completely agree in terms of the mix of skills, from like a technical understanding of the product that you can actually satisfy the community in understanding it, but then also the kind of social skills and patience to deal with the complaints in a very mature, respectful, and professional manner. So tell me a little bit more about this kind of experience here, and maybe how it shaped you as a founder. You talked through some of the like valuable skills that you got a chance to develop. How do you think that experience as a community manager has like led you to shape how you interact with your users and customers today with Phylax?
Yeah. So what I did was a developer relations engineer, so which is like slightly different from like community management is part of your JD, right?
Sure.
One thing as a as a developer, you wear many. So when you wear the hat of the community manager, you have to basically, it's very helpful to think of the community as a system, and then you map out where do your users live, in which platforms, and then you want to make sure that when a new user enters your community, they know where they have to go to perform some user goal. So if they want to do support, they have to go to that platform. If they want to give feedback, they have to go to that platform. If they want to interact, they have to go to that platform. And it's very important to create a map and make it intuitive for users to understand where they have to go, because a lot of times, companies, they have GitHub issues and support email and Telegram and Discord and forum, and it's very and then you get this fragmentation of community where some people ask support in Zendesk, some people ask support in GitHub, and so if as a user it's very hard to self-serve because the information is fragmented, right? So it's very important to map out the community and decide where every user goal should be performed, and then make sure you funnel your users to the appropriate platform. And another thing I found is that it's you really want to increase you really want to make it easy for users to self-serve, right? Ideally, whenever you produce a single piece of content, you want it to serve as many users as possible. So, for example, I think very early on is very bad practice for startups to have things like Zendesk, where it's one-to-one, right? So, one user will ask one question to someone, and then they will get a reply. It only serves them. So then 10 users will ask you the same question. You have to spend the same amount of time to reply to them. While, for example, if you use a forum, then the other users will be able to find that forum post and self-serve, right? Figure out the problem on their own. So I think it's very important as a startup you have to do the things about scale. So you have to do with users, every day. But at the same time, keep an eye on how you can reuse the content, and in a way that allows future users to self-serve. So maybe you periodically, upload questions that come up often into a knowledge base. Ideally, I'm a very people don't use forums anymore, and that's sad actually, because a forum is a naturally organic knowledge base. So it's forums. When you do, for example, in my first company, we did support on forum. At that time, actually created a very organic and very rich knowledge base where people could, self-serve for most of the issues. And I think it's very important for, newer startups now that you probably use Discord or some similar community platforms to always try to think of how can I can increase self-serve for users.
Yeah, it's an interesting rationale for like the rise of Discord servers that companies put together. I had always kind of thought of communities as primarily for driving user engagement, but it's a great point in terms of the value that it provides for self-service and just reducing the number of tickets and making it easier for users to get their answers on demand as well. If they're able to just search and find their answer as opposed to waiting for someone on the help desk to actually respond to their ticket, it's a completely different user experience as well. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you about this was a kind of like key crisis that you dealt with while you were working in a developer relations role. But I have to imagine I already know what it is with the breach that you ran into at Nomad. So maybe tell a little bit more of the story of what happened there and how you ended up dealing with it and what that was like kind of living through that.
So I think that's interesting because when I entered the Web3 world, I actually decided that what I really like is to build products. So I actually became a protocol engineer. So in Nomad, I was working as a protocol engineer, not as a dev anymore, because I was like, I'm done with that profession. But a protocol engineer in an open source product as Nomad was, especially in crypto, it's very user centric. You always talk to the developers, right? So you live on the public channel. So going through the Nomad incident was a very interesting experience because you had to talk with a lot of users that got accepted. Some of them lost their, life savings. And it was a very humbling experience. And what makes it even more complicated is that it's a very complicated legal matter, right? So you can't really, basically after an incident happens, after a hack happens in the company, essentially our communications go through legal vetting. So when you talk with users, you have to be very, very careful of what you say and how you express yourself, which makes it very actually complicated for companies. I made a presentation in DevCon in Bogota, which is the biggest Ethereum conference 2 years ago. Basically the moment the hack happens, basically as a company, you have to immediately start conversation with the lawyers. You see all communications, you talk with your legal team, then you make a public statement about it, and then you start in two processes. One process is talking with authorities to start attempts to trace the funds. So try to identify who took them and then try to convince them to return them. And the other is an ongoing process, again, in very close collaboration with your legal team, in where you publicly communicate with your users and you communicate what happened, what are the next steps you're taking. It's very important to have a very open standard of communication to the extent that you legally can. So it's a very actually complicated landscape to navigate.
And there was an interesting scenario with the Nomad breach as well, right? Where if I remember correctly, they offered to like let people who returned the funds that were stolen keep some small portion. Like they would receive a financial reward for returning the funds that were stolen, which was it's super fascinating to me because one, that's obviously expensive. Two, you're kind of like hoping that people are going to confess to essentially committing a crime. And three, you're kind of giving up the hope of disciplining those people if you're saying that you're going to just kind of like let them walk free if they pay back the funds that were stolen. What was your perspective on that? Like, has that been the common approach since then?
Yeah.
It has. Okay.
So in crypto, because of how blockchains work, once the funds are out, there is no way to force them to send them back in, right? Technologically at least. So what happens is basically, so the best practice here is essentially a stick and carrot. So the carrot is that if you return them, we will make a legal agreement with you where we will not prosecute you for what happened, and you can keep 10% as a bounty. If you don't return them, we are collaborating with law enforcement agencies and various security companies like TRM labs, which are basically experts in tracking the funds. So they track them on the blockchains, and then they track them on the centralized exchanges, which are used to off-ramp them. And then if you manage to get law enforcement action in time, you can basically force the centralized exchanges to give information of who received the funds, etc. So basically, you tell them that you can either take 10% and then walk free, or you can try to keep them all, but we make action, right? And if you get caught in 2 years, 3 years, maybe Interpol at some point knocks on your door, and then you go away for 20 years, right? So this has been the best practice in the crypto space so far, and in some cases it has worked. Like people, after a few months of negotiations, they agree to return the funds, especially as law enforcement agencies increasingly became more and more certain of who is the perpetrator. Obviously, a big percentage of the funds, which have never been returned, not in Noma specifically, but in general, is when you have state actors involved, right? So for in a lot of cases, actually North Korea and Lazarus Group behind it. To give you a very interesting statistic is that the running hack was a 600 million in total, 600 million stolen from the London Bridge. And that was tracked, and it's been verified. There is a lot of security researchers in our space that do this work. They're called sleuth, and they track the funds, and it's verified to be in state actors in North Korea. But it was North Korea behind the attack. And their nuclear program is estimated to be around $1.2 billion, right? So, financed their nuclear program, right? So obviously, when you have these actors behind the hand, then there is no hope for collaboration. But in a lot of other occurrences, like for example, when the Euler Labs was hacked for, I don't remember, a big amount, like 100 million or something. After a few months, they were able to convince the hacker to return 90% of the funds back, right? Because I imagine, and this is only my speculation, in that meantime, law enforcement agencies made some breakthroughs, and they were probably, starting to zero in on the identity. And, the attacker ended up understanding that it's better to walk away with 10% than 90, walk away with 90% and then maybe never see the light of day,
right?
Like 1 or 2 or 3 years.
It's actually a really interesting statement just about law enforcement in general and the financial return on law enforcement, right? Because what you're basically suggesting in that scenario is the law enforcement involvement allowed for the return of funds that otherwise they probably wouldn't have felt pressured to return. So in that case, let's say it's like 90% of 100 million that's returned, which is then like a $90 million return on the existence of that law enforcement group, which is just kind of interesting to think about it from a financial term as opposed to just like in the interest of protecting public safety more generally, right? Okay, so
I think this is interesting to underline that that the argument that blockchains and blockchain uh, technologies allow for money laundering is fundamentally wrong, um, because actually blockchain technologies allows for a very clear and very easy tracking of the funds. When most all of the time, funds are we lose track of the funds when they go to the centralized exchanges and then they are often right. So actually, most of the times funds are lost because the centralized exchanges in various jurisdictions don't cooperate in time to stop the funds from being used. So there is certain exchanges that are known to not collaborate easily, which are used by the hackers to offer the hackers. A lot of the time, the funds are just stay dormant for years. So this is very interesting that these actually blockchain technologies makes it easier to track where the funds go. And this is why this argument from special regulators is fundamentally false. And that's why only 1% of money laundering happens on chain. It's much easier to do that through shell corporations and various banking schemes.
Certainly, people are going to find a way to launder money, regardless of whether it's on the blockchain or not, right? To your point. Okay, tell me a little bit more then how this experience shaped the birth of Phylax, right? You just started Phylax, to my understanding, earlier this year, 2024. How did it come about, and what were maybe some of the lessons that you learned from the Nomad breach that made you decide, hey, this is the right problem in Web3 security to go and tackle?
I think the Nomad incident really made me understand that security is probably one of the most important problems that crypto have right now.
Sure.
As slowly crypto goes mainstream, it's obvious that a huge impediment of crypto being adopted as a technology is that there is 1% chance that you will lose all your money, right? Imagine if you have your money in a bank in a savings account. Imagine if there was 1% chance every year that you would lose everything, right? You wouldn't use that bank probably.
Need a lot more interest.
Yeah, right, exactly. So this is the issue we have right now in crypto, and it's either from everyday people that like you and me or institutions. And crypto will win, right? This idea of a new financial system will win when the pension fund of teachers in Canada or something decides to put 200 mil not on corporate bonds, but on MakerDAO, on a DeFi protocol, right? And to do that, we need to make crypto secure, right? We have to almost minimize to almost zero the probability of, right? And this is the Nomad incident really made me understand that and push me to do security, because this is how I felt that I could have a larger impact on the space and crypto, which I think is important.
Yeah. So then, thinking about the kind of security ecosystem of crypto, blockchain more generally, I'm certainly not an expert in this, so I'm gonna lean on you. But when I think about it, I think about monitoring transactions, so monitoring for malicious activity on the chain. But even when that happens, if the action already takes place, then it can be very hard to revert, to my understanding, unless it's caught in that very brief window before that block is published. I might not be getting these terms perfectly correct, but hopefully you kind of understand where I'm going and correct me. The other piece I think about is application security. So any kind of decentralized app that's being developed, making sure that there aren't vulnerabilities that exist within that application, similar to how you might think about software security today for Web 2. And then there's the actual protocols and the underlying blockchain architecture that's being developed for each of these. So those are kind of the three layers I think about when it comes to security. What else would you add, or how would you kind of classify the broader security ecosystem?
I think First, I wouldn't say that. I think the protocol security is really, most of the protocols are developed in a very slow, very deliberate manner. So I can't think of a hack so far that happened at the protocol level, where the Ethereum protocol was hacked. And so I don't really, I think that's, when we talk about security in that layer, we talk more about economic security and what happens if, some actor tries to perform, some state actor tries to disrupt the blockchain. I think most of the hacks come basically from vulnerabilities in the protocol on the smart contract code, right? Bugs. So this is one. The second is attaching the mechanism of the smart contract. So when the smart contracts are not implemented in the right way, there is not a bug in the code, but you take advantage of some of low liquidity, and basically you push the mechanism to behave in a way that was not expected, right? So it's not a smart contract vulnerability per se. It's more of a, let's say, economic attack on the mechanism, where you want to you inject a lot of capital for a very short amount of time, and you make the mechanism performing like very erratic ways, and in that moment you can take funds. So that would say economic attacks. Then, as you said, vulnerability on the dApp, on the front end, and actually we see a lot of supply chain attacks there, where attackers manage to attack some library, to replace some library in the JavaScript ecosystem, and then when the user has to use the dApp, they get drained, they lose their funds. We have some attacks on the DNS layer up here, which is very interesting. One or twice, DNS has been hijacked, and the user served with a malicious version of the front end, so that has happened a few times. And finally, a very big vector, a huge vector, I would say, are social engineering.
Yeah.
So it's either on Twitter, they have Twitter accounts, right? So they take a big protocol, they hack their Twitter account, they post a malicious link about some airdrop or something. So that happens a lot. Or they impersonate Twitter accounts. So you have Cloudflare, for example, the main Twitter account, and then they make a post, and then below an account posted as Cloudflare with 2 A's or something. So we have a lot of social engineering attacks in space. And the reason we have is that there is no, it's immutable. Once something happens, there is no way to take action back, right? So they don't need, you perform this attack and you just need 100 people to click. That's all, right? And you make 500,000. So these are more or less the vector wars.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal overview and a great point as far as social engineering as well. I think easy to kind of overlook that in terms of the security ecosystem, because it's so much easier to focus on the more technical pieces. But at the end of the day, there's kind of a technical element to solving social engineering challenges as well. And a great reminder in terms of the importance of just like Twitter's security and how that has ramifications for blockchain applications as well. So then thinking through Phylax, you just described this kind of large attack surface of how you think about Web3, right? And there's several kind of areas that you just mentioned, whether it's the smart contracts themselves, the smart contract mechanism, social engineering, the applications. How did you decide with Phylax that this was the kind of right area to tackle within the ecosystem?
So I started developing and monitoring like a Prometheus graph analogous for dApps, right? So an easy way for a dApp developer to monitor the state of the dApp. But I quickly ended up to the realization that monitoring is not very important in crypto, because by the time you see it, it's already done. And Prometheus, for example, in DevOps, you want to see that your server will blow up before it blows up, so you can take some action. So there's no user degradation. So there's no user experience degradation. and it led me to the conclusion that actually I want to prevent them. Right? And smart contract vulnerabilities and economic attacks are probably one of the biggest vectors we see, where they manage because an interesting thing with smart contracts is that there is nothing private. So the moment you have a smart contract, a protocol live, everyone can inspect the code, and they have as much time as they need to find that small vulnerability, right? Maybe you create your smart contract and you change the implementation a bit, and then you add a very, 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 very small bug that is almost impossible to find. But if someone has a year to analyze your smart contracts and test it, but there is no privacy, right? When you in Web 2, you have your servers, and people can sort of, poke the API and try to understand how it interacts internally, but they have no idea really. Everything is like hidden. With smart contracts, everything is public, right? And you have a huge bug bounty essentially, because when you have $100 million stored in a smart contract, that's your bounty, right? So there is a bug bounty for like $100 million, and you have your code, and you can test it and prod it and really dive into it for as much time as you want. So this is how we ended up wanting to solve that vector.
So tell me a little bit more about just how Phylax positions itself compared to other alternatives that are on the market. My understanding is traditionally when you think about DApp security testing, it's largely a very services-driven business. So the same way you kind of had penetration testing lead the way for like applications in Web 2.0 and traditional security, the same kind of technology or approach emerged with Web 3, where there was kind of this, maybe not requirement, but like stamp of approval that different applications tried to use, where they said, okay, look, our application has been verified by this third party, and therefore you know that as a user, you're safe to actually go ahead and use it. So there was this whole ecosystem that was developed. I know several companies have tried to emerge to productize that kind of offering, but it doesn't have quite that same stamp of approval. And to my understanding, that hadn't caught on all that much. So tell me a little bit more about just kind of how that's changed and how you position Phylax.
Yeah, so the way that security happens in our space is first you have to do a lot of testing on, and actually good, easy testing frameworks have only come up the latest years. It's a very nascent industry, right? So the best practices are rapidly being developed. And then, as you say, audits, we call them audits, is basically the stamp of approval. The issue with audits are two. One, they're extremely expensive. So to give you an understanding, is for an average protocol, an audit could be something around $200K, right? And the moment you change your code, immediately the audit is more. Because even a small addition to the code can add a vulnerability because there's some complicated interaction between all your components or with other components, right? You're building Lego blocks. All the dApps can be trustlessly decomposed with one another. So you have not only to think about the second or, the first order effects of your smart contracts or your system, but then you also have to be able to reason about the second and third order effects with other protocols. Especially when you talk about mechanisms, but this can get very complicated. Because maybe you use some token from another protocol, and what happens if that token goes to zero in one block? How does your system behave to that? Can your system handle that situation? So audits are very slow, right? You have to book them a few months in advance, and then they take another month to finish. And then if you want to make a change, boom, you have to re-audit again. So what happens really is people don't audit as soon as they should, right? And realistically, you can't spend, $1 million every year in audits. So that was so that's the reality right now. And on top of that, the solidity and the EVM, which is this, VM where you run your smart contracts on Ethereum, does not lend itself to. There's a lot of foot guns. The solidity, the language is not extremely well, I would say, implemented. You have to do a few weird things if you want to do some things. You can't formally verify it as you can as you should with a language where you write financial applications. So it had a lot of restrictions, right? So basically, what we're building is a way for dApps to define invariants, which are enforced at the base layer. They're enforced at the stage where the block is built, and this off-chain, essentially, evaluation of the invariants allows the users to express things that they can't express on-chain. Which means that now it's realistic to have this invariant test not run once while you develop the software, but they run continuously on their live transactions. So you can count these edge cases, which maybe you haven't thought of when you launch the smart contract. The problem usually with security in our space is that, in general, the industry is very small. Because there is no market to build a SaaS platform, right? For example, the Grafana or Prometheus example I gave, there is no business to sustain such a model. When you have 10,000, 20,000 developers, how much are you going to charge? There is no mental model. There is no TAM to build, a Prometheus or Grafana Cloud. There is no TAM to build Grafana Cloud. So all these companies really suffer from that. So they have to charge a lot of money to a small number of people. Our approach is a bit different. We are building a protocol, right? So we are building an on-chain protocol and mechanism where the dApps can define these invariants, and these are enforced at the base layer. And there is a on-chain mechanism which aligns the incentive and gives incentives to the parties. So the dApps pay for security, the base layer, receives some fees for providing the security, and this creates this mechanism. And when you have this mechanism on many networks, you start having network effects. And through this, through the system, you can have network effects where you can make it economically viable for the project through some token or through some tax system, because now you can use that as a springboard, right? So you have all these mechanisms that create this network effects over many networks. You can build multiple dApps on the same primitive. So using the same primitive, you can build fault prevention, you can build bug bounties. And through this utilization, and through these network effects, this is how you make the project viable.
So let me make sure I kind of understand what you just conveyed. My understanding from what you just said is basically the more individual networks that are using the Phylax protocol, the more data you're effectively able to gather, and the more kind of like hooks you have into the overall ecosystem. And the more hooks you have in the ecosystem, the more you're able to enforce or enact some of these different security controls with a level of standardization across all of them. So you mentioned like the ability to apply bug bounties across all of them, because then you're able to capture the right data across each network, and be able to perform like some level of additional validation or like process uniformity. Am I describing that right?
Sort of. The reality is that when you build a mechanism which is built on there's some primitives, right? So the more dApps that use this mechanism, the more examples of environments they use. So they make these primitives more valuable to the other dApps, because now there is more examples, and there is it's like JavaScript and Next, basically. The more people use Next, the more libraries that exist, the more vibrant ecosystem, which makes more viable to the next application to the next developer to use that because they can use all these examples before them.
Right.
So the more networks we integrate with, the more cooperative we have, which means that the more dApps can use Phylax to enforce these invariants, which means more and more dApps use the same primitives. So there's like these network effects from one another. And on top of that, you can reuse these primitives for other use cases. So you create this ecosystem where the value essentially accrues to the mechanism, because the mechanism is used for the dApps to pay the base layer for offering the service of security, right? And because you have this usage, so you dApps pay the base layer for security, and then you can take a small cut out of that, right? You can for example, through a tax system.
Sure. So it's really about kind of building the ecosystem and the kind of connective tissue between all these different networks. Yeah. Okay. Well,
yeah. I mean, you can even create, more. I think for us, the end game is to identify the more valuable use of this mechanism. Right? So hack prevention enables all that. But maybe the most valuable is, for example, insurance, right? Offer on-chain insurance and package it as part of this ecosystem. And this is how you make it viable as a security product.
That's a good point, how it's kind of just, again, like use the term connective tissue, and then there's actual products that you can kind of layer on top of that. And it's really just the kind of foundational building blocks that then allow you to have this kind of extra layer of security or extra value that you're providing because of the data that you then have access to through the network effect that you mentioned. So I think as we move towards wrapping up here, the important piece that I certainly am curious to get your thoughts on, and I'm sure is top of mind for a lot of listeners, we've seen in the US with the recent election, obviously skyrocketing interest in crypto, and obviously crypto prices have reflected that as well. What are your thoughts, if you have like a crystal ball in front of you, as you think about how this impacts just the adoption of crypto more generally? Are there any kind of like key landmark regulation pieces that you see coming out that kind of allows for the more stable adoption? Or do you think this is just kind of the continued momentum for the crypto ecosystem more generally? Everything just kind of moves as it has in the past with maybe just a little bit more speed?
I think the most important is that the new administration will no longer essentially weaponize the FCC against crypto as an industry. I'm not sure if you're aware of this great series of articles that Nick Carter wrote on Operation Checkpoint 2.0, where basically it's now proven that Silvergate, a bank that was known to serve crypto customers, was actually almost forced to close because they forced them essentially to stop serving crypto customers, right? And since crypto customers was basically most of their customer base, essentially they forced them out of business just because they were serving crypto. So I think the most important thing of this administration is a total difference in how they approach crypto, and instead of being in this very weird war against it, actually appointing people in agencies which are crypto friendly, which means at the very least we'll no longer have these hostile stance, right? And only that, and even without any special new piece of legislation, I think will skyrocket crypto as an industry, because the most right now, one of the most useful things in crypto, one thing that has really found PMF is stablecoins, right? So the ability to send millions of dollars online in an instant. And stablecoins, if you really think about it, is a way for the dollar to remain the dominant medium of exchange of value worldwide, right? In a world where it's becoming increasingly bipolar, the dollars actually was losing competitive power. And stable coins is a way for the dollar to remain the king, right? So I think it's actually very in the interest of the United States to be pro crypto, because if it's not the US that leads the charge in crypto as they do with AI, it will be someone else, and it will be China or Europe. Europe has actually been very weirdly pro crypto, which is a very weird thing to say. So I think it's a very good timing, so that the US doesn't need the head start.
Yeah, that's I think a great point in terms of how stable coins actually perpetuate the dollar dominance that exists around the world today, because ultimately stable coins are pegged, well, at least a lot of stable coins are pegged to the dollar. And so even though it's not like using cash, it's ultimately maintaining the worth of a US dollar as the principal benchmark, which is the important piece of the currency control to begin with, where the US then controls like the money supply and still the dollar inflation and all that good stuff. But that's a great place to end it. Odysseas, really appreciate the time. Super fascinating. Again, obviously a topic that I'm not incredibly deep on, which is always fun for me to get to dive into a little bit more. And I learned a ton just thinking about some of these different like attack surfaces that exist. Great reminders in terms of the importance of social engineering, some of the challenges as you think about following up on some of these hacks, and the carrot and the stick analogy that you used as well. So again, really, really appreciate the time.
It was a pleasure, Kyle. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.